Hello, folks. The last time we read, we finished up chapter 43, and our folks had taken off on their trips, and they weren't having the best time. They had forgotten a bunch of things, and um, Sari and Sari and Dallas were kind of lost. They didn't know where they were, and Tiller and Florida were having trouble with their boat and paddling, and their arms were tired, and they just weren't having the best time. But the kids had started telling Tiller and Sari their stories about the other homes that they'd been in when they left the orphanage. Chapter 44 is called Progress. Z was in his usual place, leaning against the door as Mr. Trevitt paced around the shack, anxious to hear about Z's progress. And you say you've spotted some possible sites, Trevitt said. Very good. Approximately how many? So far, about 25, Z said. Trevitt halted. 25, he sputtered. That's too many. Like I said before, there's a lot of stones in that holler, Z said. But 25? Are you looking for big stones or unusual piles of stones, or are you just marking any old stone you see? Z pulled a stick of gum from his pocket, unwrapped it, and popped it in his mouth. If I marked any old stone I saw, I'd have marked about 2,000 by now. Have you finished surveying? Trippett asked. Nope, I need a little more time. When are they returning? I'm not really sure when they'll be back, Z said. I'll have to check into that. You do that, Trevitt said, and speed it up. Go back over those stones you've marked and be sure they all look promising. We'll meet again tomorrow sometime. Z chewed his gum and waited. Trevitt said, Okay, here's a little more salary. That ought to cover another day's work. The rest will come if this produces any results. He handed Z some bills and reached behind him for the door handle. Z didn't budge. His gaze was fixed on Treppett's gold front tooth. Meeting's over, Trevitt said. Chapter 45 is called The Rock. It had been raining hard all afternoon, and the river was rushing along. Whew, Florida called over the noise of the surging water. We are really zipping. We must be going downstream now. The water splashed over the bow, soaking her legs. We might be drenched and lost and heading for the worst rapids you ever saw, but at least we're going the right direction, don't you think, Tiller? She swiveled to look at Tiller, whose face and poncho were soaked. What's a little rain, he said. What's a little water? What's a little lostness? He dipped his paddle hard into the water. Charge! Florida yelled above the noise of the river. Ahead was a bend, and they aimed for the middle of it. The wind and rain whipped against her face. She loved the feel of it, all of it. The charging down the river, the paddle diving in and out, the water spraying up over the bow, the rain pelting down on her. Around the bend they flew, and there, directly in front of them, was a huge boulder. Tiller, she called. Rock! Turn! The boat veered sharply to the right of the boulder and caught in a swirl of water, plunging them back toward the boulder. The boat smacked against it once, twice, hard, and the water swirled against the back of the boat, spinning it, and then, in one mighty surge, tipping it. When Florida surfaced, she was already far downstream of the boulder, spluttering and coughing. Looking behind her, she had a quick glimpse of her life jacket bobbing away, way back there, and then she was under again. This is it, she thought. I'm gonna die. When she resurfaced, she glimpsed Tiller upstream, trying to cling to one end of the boat. Grab onto something, anything, he yelled. I can't swim. She saw the boat reel and smash hard against another rock. Just before she was pulled under again, she saw Tiller lose his grip and disappear beneath the boat. How can water push so hard, she thought. Help me, Dallas. Help me. Help me. Chapter 46 is called Stones in the Holler. It was a glorious morning in the holler. A cool front had come through during the night. The air was fresh and clear with a mild breeze sifting through the treetops, ruffling leaves. Z was ambling along, poking a stick at the various stones. He bent down to gather 3 stones and pile them near a tree trunk. There, he thought, that looks about right. Earlier, he'd collected flat stones from the creek and piled them carefully near a birch grove. With a piece of charred wood he'd brought with him, he made mysterious-looking squiggles on the top of the stone. Perfect. He pulled out a fresh piece of paper and started a new map. The cabin was in the center. He marked the 2 new piles he'd made, and then he walked around the cabin about 20 feet from it, marking large stones that had already been there, and new piles of stones that he'd gathered Next, he walked up the opposite hill and looked around. He spotted a faint path winding past a clump of violets and curving beyond a funny-looking bush. He followed the path in and out of the trees until it seemed to end beneath an overhanging willow. Near the base of the willow was a smooth gray stone, half covered with leaves. He bent down and lifted the stone, discovering freshly turned earth beneath it. He dug only a few inches before hitting something hard and metallic. Z scraped the dirt from the top of a metal box. It was painted, Saries, Keep Out. The latch was locked. Z stuffed Saries' box in his sack and then set off in search of a tiller box. Chapter 47 is called Running. Dallas and Sari had reached a summit and could see a narrow path spiraling steeply downward toward a stream. "Water!" Dallas shouted. "Real water! We may be completely lost, but there's water!" Dallas picked up a stick from the path and tapped it in front of him. "Hey, Sari," he called behind him. "I'll meet you further down." And with that, he took off running. He sailed down the path, dodging roots and whooping and laughing. And as he rounded a bend, a small furry animal leapt out in front of him. It looked like a rat. Dallas jumped over it, skidded, and landed hard on his back. Something crumpled inside him. Florida, he thought. Florida's in trouble. Chapter 48 is called More Shopping. Mrs. Treffitt had taken the bus to Prosper City and was standing in front of the First Avenue jewelry store. She wasn't sure what had brought her to this place, only that she was here and wanted very much to go inside. She took a deep breath, straightened her back, and opened the door. Overhead, slender tubes of light beamed down on the display cases. The counters were polished to a high sheen, and inside the display cases, shiny bright mirrors reflected gold and silver and sparkly gems. A man in a dark suit drifted toward her. "May I help you?" he asked. "Are you looking for something in particular?" Mrs. Treffitt glanced at the display case, spotted a gold necklace with tiny red and white stones in it. "That's nice," she said, indicating the necklace. The man slipped his hand into his pocket, removed a ring of keys, and deftly unlocked the case, holding out a mirrored base on which the necklace rested. "A lovely choice," he said, releasing it from the base. He tilted the counter's mirror toward her as she tried it on. "Ah," he said, absolutely perfect. It's you." Mrs. Treffitt smiled at her reflection. The necklace was perfect. "Rubies and opals, of course," the man said, "and the finest gold, of course." "Of course," Mrs. Treffitt murmured. "Rubies and opals," she thought. "Real rubies? Real opals?" "Is this for a special occasion?" the man asked. "What? Oh, yes it is." Her mind raced. What sort of a special occasion, she thought. "A cruise, actually," she blurted. "My husband and I are going on a special cruise to an island." "In the Caribbean?" the man said. "Why, yes," Mrs. Treffitt lied. "How did you know?" "That's where beautiful women like yourself should be going." Mrs. Treffitt's face reddened. "Why, thank you." "Does Madame wish to know the price?" The man smiled, a gentle, kind smile. Mrs. Treffitt nodded. $18,000, he said. "Completely reasonable, of course, for such a fine work of art." "Oh, completely," Mrs. Treffitt said, brushing at a piece of lint on her sleeve. She thought surely she had heard wrong. $18,000? For a necklace? Mrs. Treffitt felt warm and agitated. "Is your air conditioning working?" The man hurried to the thermostat. "Yes, it seems to be working. Is Madame not comfortable?" She fidgeted with the necklace's clasp. "Like you say, it's perfect, and rubies and opals are so—" She didn't know how to finish. She pretended to study the gems. "I'm just not sure this will go with my gown." "Gown? Why did I say gown? What a silly word, gown." "Madame is more than welcome to bring in her gown and try it on with the necklace," the man said. He followed her to the door and opened it for her. "Shall I put the necklace aside for you?" Mrs. Treffitt hurried through the door. She wanted to say, "No, lock it up, take it away," but instead she said, "Sure." "Your name?" "Treffitt," she said. "Marjorie Treffitt. Bye-bye." And she rushed down the street, wondering why she'd given her real name and why she'd added that silly bye-bye. She didn't stop until she was several blocks beyond the jeweler's. When she did stop, she leaned against a building. $18,000? She could hardly imagine that kind of money. Where did people even make that kind of money, that they could throw it away on an $18,000 necklace? Her mind reeled with all the other things that could be done with that much money. The following day, Mr. Treffitt made his way into the same jewelry store, carefully removing his watch before he entered. He scuttled quickly to the watch counter and peered inside. "May I help you?" the salesman asked. Mr. Trippett had decided to be firm and decisive. I'm looking for a watch. There, something like that. He pointed to the display case. A perfect choice, the man said, removing it from the case. Would the gentleman care to try it? Yes, Mr. Trippett said, offering his wrist. One of our finest, the salesman said. Have you owned one of these before? Yes, I have, Mr. Trippett lied. I lost it, unfortunately. Lost? What a tragedy. Mr. Trippett tried to look forlorn. Absolutely, he said. One doesn't like to lose such a fine watch. No, sir, one does not. Mr. Trippett turned his wrist this way and that. Perfect, the salesman said. It's made for you. Yes, Mr. Trippett thought, it does look as if it were made especially for me. The salesman was saying something about the quality of the gold and diamonds, and then, does the gentleman wish to know the price? The price? Why not? $9,000, the salesman said. Quite reasonable, of course, given the diamonds, and absolutely reasonable, Mr. Trippett interrupted. Does the gentleman wish to purchase now? Mr. Trippett's eyes roamed the display case. You know, he said quickly, there are a few others I'd like to try also. The salesman glanced down at the case. But I'm in too much of a hurry right now, Mr. Trippett said. Perhaps I should come back when I have more time. He pulled the strap, releasing it. As he placed the watch back on the counter, his fingers trembled. Yes, quite in a hurry today. He turned toward the door. I'll be back through. Yes, I will. Would you like me to place it aside for you? Absolutely, Mr. Trippett said, reaching for the door handle. Your name, sir? Trippett. George Trippett. Mr. Trippett couldn't wait to get out of that store. Trippett, the salesman said. Ah, Trippett, you're going on a cruise. Mr. Trippett didn't hear him because he was already on the sidewalk, lunging down the street. $9,000 for a watch, he thought. What a rip-off. But as he scurried down the walk, Mr. Trippett glanced at his wrist. It did look spectacular on me, he thought. Perhaps the quality of the diamonds. Yes, it was the diamonds. Maybe $9,000 is quite reasonable for a watch with real diamonds. Chapter 49. Underwater. The boat was upside down. Tiller was beneath it, trying to cling to one of the struts as the boat hurtled through the water. He was dragging along, smashing against rocks, dunked under surges of water. Each time he tried to get out from underneath the boat, it slammed down on him again. He was desperately hoping Florida had made it to shore. He was regretting that neither he nor Florida had been wearing their life jackets. Stupid old man, he thought. As if the river agreed with him, it surged over him, dunking him and loosening his grasp on the boat. He felt it fly free as he tumbled along underwater. Florida can't swim. If only he'd known that beforehand. He felt suddenly weak and powerless, as limp as a rag doll. Downriver, Florida was clinging to a boulder in the middle of the river. It was slimy and mossy. Her hands were slipping. She remembered a boy at the home telling her about learning to float. He said, you take in a huge breath of air and just lie there like a dead man. As the raging water loosened her grip on the boulder, she gulped in some air and closed her eyes. I'm going to float like a dead man, she thought. I hope I don't end up a dead girl. For a few seconds, she felt her body suspended on the water, and then she was slammed against the floating log and knocked under the water. Her knees scraped the rocks on the bottom. Maybe it's not so deep here. If only I could stand. If only this putrid water would quit pushing me. Chapter 50. The Feeling. Dallas was lying on the path, feeling like a scarecrow whose stuffing had been pulled out. You okay? Sari said, running up behind him. Slipped, he said. His head throbbed and his arm felt as if the Burgerton boys had just been at work on him. He closed his eyes, and as he did so, he saw the image of Joey, only this time Joey was trying to breathe air into Dallas. Sari, he said, I just want you to know that if I die, it's not your fault. What? She said. Die? Do you feel like you're going to die? No, but I'm just saying. Hush, she said, reaching for her backpack. I'm hoping I brought enough money in case we need to get you to a doctor. Don't suppose there are any Understone funds out here, Understone funds? What was it about the Understone funds that had been nagging at the back of Dallas's brain? Something was bothering him, but he couldn't figure out what it was. I hope we're not too awful far from Ruby Holler, or Boxton, Sari said. Boxton, the Treppids, Understone funds. Uh-oh. You okay, Sari said? You a little dizzy? Dallas was trying to remember when he and Florida had run into Mr. Trippett outside Grace's diner. Had they mentioned the Understone funds? Why had they done that? Dallas. A little movie was playing in Dallas's head. In it, he saw Mr. Trepid roaming through the holler searching for the Understone funds. Sary, he said, I did a stupid, stupid thing. Nonsense, she said. Anyone can fall. It's not your fault you fell. Dallas closed his eyes again. He was going to have to tell her. And then, suddenly washing over him was that feeling again that Florida was in trouble. Sary, wait, something's wrong with Florida. Florida? What are you talking about? I know it. I feel it. Something's wrong. Something's happened. We've got to go find her and tell her. He scrambled to his feet. We've got to go. Something's awful wrong. His chest felt so tight that he had to gulp for air. Sary put her hand to her throat and said, maybe it's Tiller, not Florida. I've got that feeling too. Well, so do I, Dallas said. Let's get moving. They scrambled down the path to the stream and at its bottom, frantically trying to get their bearings, but they had no idea which direction to turn. Just take a wild stab, Sary said. Upstream or downstream? What does your gut tell you? Downstream, Dallas said. They headed off along the bank, clambering over roots and rocks, weaving through the thickets. From the distance came the crack of a gun, followed by a shout. On the opposite side of the stream, 2 young men emerged. They were scruffy, maybe 16 or 17 years old, and they both carried guns. The taller of the 2 young men said to the other, Heck, we almost bagged us a couple of people with that shot. To Sary and Dallas, he said, You seen a deer come through here? No, Sary said. The shorter boy said, I told you it wasn't no deer, it was a bobcat. I ought to be able to tell a bobcat from a deer, the taller boy said. What are you 2 doing up here? Hiking, Sary said. Don't suppose you can tell us where we are? The taller boy took a swig from a hip flask and wiped his mouth on his sleeve. You don't know where you are? Not precisely, Sary said. We started out in Ruby Holler, and that's where we're aiming to get back to. Ruby Holler, the shorter boy said. Never heard of it. How about Boxton, Dallas said. You know where that is? Sure, the taller boy said. He was about to say more, and the other boy interrupted him. You do not, he said. You've never been to Boxton. You don't know where it is, see? Oh, I must have been thinking about some other town. Well, do you know where we could find a phone, Sary said. Sure, the shorter boy said. Sure, you just keep on going downstream, and real close by there's a little diner, see? You can get something to eat and use the phone. Tell you what, we'll even watch your stuff for you if you want. We'll wait here for you. That stuff looks pretty heavy. That's mighty nice of you, Sary said. You say it's real close, this diner? Sure, 5 minutes away. Sary removed her backpack and set it on the ground. Okay then, Dallas, you ready? Dallas was torn. His old self would have leapt at the chance to dump this heavy backpack and get to food. But what he was hearing in his head was Florida saying, Don't trust him. Dallas, Sary repeated. Come on, let's go to that diner and find out where we are. We can use the phone and get a message to Z. Z? Is that the guy who hauled the boat to the river? Yes, Sary said. He'll know how to find Tiller in Florida, and us. As Sary and Dallas started toward the diner, Dallas glanced back at the boys, who were now sitting beside Sary and Dallas's backpacks, smiling. Bye-bye, they called. We'll be right here waiting for you. Chapter 51 is called Z. As Z drove down the road away from Ruby Holler, he wished he'd never gotten mixed up with Trepid, and he hoped he could keep Trepid at bay until Tiller and Sary got back. What Trepid hadn't reckoned on was that Z had known Tiller and Sary for most of his life, and that Z's cabin was over the far side of the holler, which made Z their nearest neighbor. It was Z who had driven Tiller in Florida and the boat down to the river, and Sary and Dallas back home again, and it was Z that they had asked to keep an eye on their place while they were gone. And it was Z who would meet Tiller and Florida at the end of their journey and drive them and the boat home. Z glanced at himself in his rearview mirror. I gotta get a haircut, he thought, and a shave, and clean up my place, maybe wash these clothes, maybe clean up this here truck too. He wished Sary and Tiller would hurry up and get back. He needed to tell them about Trepid, and he also needed to make his confessions. His first confession would be easy enough. He'd tell him that he was the one who'd gotten Dallas's passport. He hadn't seen any harm in doing that job for Trepid, except that he couldn't locate a birth certificate, so he'd had a friend forge one. Z hadn't felt too guilty about that until he'd discovered that Dallas was the boy who was going to accompany Sary on her trip. He'd have to tell Sary the truth. His second confession was going to be harder. He thought about Tiller and Sary's place with its cozy quilts and always the smell of something good cooking. I'm a lousy cook, and there's fleas all in my place. Z opened the glove compartment and fished through the mess of papers inside. He pulled out one wrinkled piece and smoothed it against the steering wheel. It was a copy of the hospital records he'd found after Sari, Dallas, Tiller, and Florida had gone off on their trips. He didn't know what had made him go back and look at more records. He didn't need to. He'd already gotten a passport for Dallas, but he'd found it interesting looking at those things, at the lists of all the babies born and how much they weighed and how long they were. One little baby weighed only 4 ounces. That's not much more than a little bird, he thought. Z had already checked the records for February and March of the year Dallas and Florida were born. Now he flipped to April, and there in the entry for April 4th it listed twins born at 7:45 a.m., a boy and a girl. His eyes moved to the middle column where the mother's name was listed. He thought he was going to have a heart attack. That's my wife, he thought. My old wife. My only old wife. He tried to do some quick figuring, but his mind was racing. He could hardly breathe. Was that the year she left? She left one snowy, cold November day. A snowy, freezing cold November day. What year was that? An idea took hold in his brain and raced around like a rabid dog. Those twins could be my twins. They could be my kids. I could be a father. Z didn't know what to do with this information. It was too much for a man to take in. I gotta let my head find a place to put it. Maybe he should tell those kids straight out and take them to his place. They'd be a ready-made family, but he didn't know the first thing about kids. Maybe he'd better study up first. Maybe he'd better check what year his wife left. Now, as he drove away from the Holler, he folded the paper and shoved it back in the glove compartment. Maybe he ought to learn how to cook first. Maybe he ought to save up some money. Maybe he ought to... And on he went down the road thinking, maybe oughta, maybe oughta. Chapter 52, The One-Log Raft. Florida tumbled along underwater, knees and elbows scraping rocks. The current surged and rolled over her, batting her around like an old sack. When she could push against the bottom hard enough, she lunged to the surface to gulp air before the river dumped her again. She was mad. Mad at the river, mad at the rocks, mad at herself for not knowing how to swim. You're not going to beat me, putrid river. Her next lunge to the surface brought her forehead smack against a wide log floating free in the water. She grabbed for it, pulling herself across it, hanging on as it careened wildly down the river. A raft, she thought. A crazy one-log raft. She had no control over the log, but it kept her head above the water so that she could breathe, more than one gulp at a time. Ahead, the river churned toward the next bend. If only I could get to the bank, she thought. If only I could see Tiller. It was hard to look back without tipping off the log. She saw the boat spinning crazily upside down, but she didn't see Tiller. Tiller! She shouted, and then again, louder. She didn't recognize her own call, so loud and urgent like a bellowing bull. Tiller! But there was no answer, and she barreled on down the river on her one-log raft. Chapter 53, The Dunces. This sure is more than 5 minutes we've been hiking, Sari said. More like 45 minutes, Dallas said. Don't see any sign of a diner. You know what I'm thinking, Sari? I'm thinking those 2 boys were pulling our legs. There's no diner out here. They probably stolen our backpacks. Sari halted, smacking her hand against her forehead. I'm such a dunce sometimes. No, you're not, Dallas said. You just think everybody's good and that everybody tells the truth. Sari put a hand on Dallas's shoulder. I do think that, she said. That's why I'm feeling like such a dunce right now. Sari untied her yellow scarf and jammed it in her pocket. Okay then, us 2 dunces are going to find a way out of this place. Overhead, the sun was covered with a haze. The air felt heavy, steamy, pressing in on them as they continued along the narrow path. We better find a town pretty soon, Dallas said. He didn't want to tell Sari that the awful feeling he'd had about Florida being in trouble was getting stronger. He was certain of it now. She was in trouble. She was in the river. He knew it clearly, as if he had a crystal ball. If we find a town, the people in the town will at least know where they are, and then we'll know where we are. Does that buddy of Tiller's, that Z guy, have a phone? No, but I can leave a message for him at Grace's Diner. He checks in there regularly. I think I've seen that guy before, Dallas said. I think I've seen him with Mr. Trepid. No, Sari said. I certainly hope not. That Z guy doesn't talk too much, does he? Dallas said. Not too much. He lives by himself, so he's not used to talking much. What happened? Dallas said. At one time, did he have brothers or sisters or kids or a wife and they all got drowned or killed or something? You're starting to sound like Florida, Sari said. I think Z has a brother or two, but they live out west somewhere. I've never met him anyway, and he did have a wife once, but not for long. Dallas was picturing Z living with his wife and the two of them strolling through the holler. What happened to his wife? She didn't much take to living in the holler, I guess. She wanted to see the world. She hated being stuck up there in his little cabin, so one day she up and left. Did they have any kids? Dallas asked. Nope. Did he ever see her again? Dallas, you sure ask a lot of questions. I was just wondering, that's all. Seems to me if your wife up and left, you'd go after her, wouldn't you? Oh, I suppose. So why didn't Z go after his wife? Sari picked up a stick lying across the path. It was a long time ago, 10, maybe 15 years ago. I think he did go after her, but I don't think he found her. That's a shame, Dallas said. He pictured Z sitting all by himself on the porch of his cabin. Hey, look, we've been yakking and not paying any attention, and I think we found a farm. See? Way over there? Sari raised both of her arms in the air. A farm, civilization, people, a phone. Let's run. And the two of them took off, running through the woods, leaping over logs, and dodging branches. I'm going to stop right there for today at the end of chapter 53.